Believe it or not, some people still believe that there is no obligation to pay council tax.
Did you know the council tax is unlawful?
There's no obligation to pay tax.
Did you know that council tax is an unlawful tax?
Local Government Finance Act 1992.
The 1992 Government Finance Act does not mean that you have to pay for council tax because acts are not law.
So he's saying this says law. I'm sorry, that word says act.
Every time I read it, it says ACT, Act.
So I thought in this video I would break down very simply why there is an obligation to pay council tax, why it is lawful, and why acts indeed are law. So let's get into it. Now, the primary reason it seems to me that people often believe that council tax is unlawful or that there's no obligation to pay council tax is the idea and the notion of consent to be governed. And people believe that if they don't individually consent to acts of parliament, then acts of parliament have no force on them and therefore they don't have to comply. Obviously, that's not true, and this video will serve as a very brief, the briefest, I suppose, of overviews of English history and why acts of parliament are law and there is an obligation to pay council tax. So we go right back to the origins of acts of parliament, and indeed right back to Edward I, who formed the first parliament, which was recalled about 46 times in the first year in 1275, and the first Act of Parliament, which was the Statute of Westminster of 1275. Now, whilst the majority of that is no longer in force today, this was the first bit of legislation which codified and reduced to writing the law as it then was. But then people confuse this notion with common law. But to understand common law, we have to go back even further through the development of common law right back to the Norman Conquest in 1066. Now, this is not going to turn into a history lesson, but what I will say is that the common law principles that applied to everybody throughout the jurisdiction of the courts, irrespective of their knowledge or agreement with said decisions, went right back to the Norman Conquest of 1066. So essentially, the legal customs and traditions that were developed across the whole of the nation between 1066 and 1275, with Edward I's first Parliament and first Act of Parliament, which codified that law, meant that everything that went before was common law. It was the initial decisions of the king, and there was one court which was in Westminster, and this made those decisions that were binding upon everybody across the whole of the nation, regardless of their knowledge or agreement. So then we have the Act of the Statute of Westminster of 1275. Being one of the earliest, it was one of the earliest written laws passed by Parliament, which was followed by the courts. It established this notion of precedent, and that acts by Parliament would be enacted and applicable to all British subjects and citizens, the distinction of which is a topic for another video. Then we have the development of the supremacy of Parliament, which was throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, and we have all sorts of bits of chunks of history, such as the English Civil War, the Glorious Revolution, and of course the Reformation. Again, subjects for another video. But to put this into very simple context, there was a huge dispute and debate between the royalists and parliamentarians, with the ultimate result being that Parliament's supremacy was firmly established and that Parliament had the ultimate authority to make laws that would be binding on all British subjects and citizens, irrespective of their knowledge or agreement. As a side note, one of the reasons that Edward I created the first Statute of Westminster and the taxes that went along with it was because of all of the ongoing battles which needed to be paid for, but again, subject for another video. But ultimately, you might think of that as the ultimate origin of taxes, where we come back eventually to council tax, but more about that in a moment. Also, the legal principle of ignorance being no excuse is also a 16th century notion, with the legal maxim of ignorantia Ignominus legis neminem excusat. Ignorance of the law excuses no one. This has been a long-standing legal principle in England and Wales and most of the world. And again, this principle dictates that individuals are bound by the law, regardless of being aware of it or having any knowledge of it. This principle has been consistently upheld in court right up to the present day, including right up as far as Crown and Jagged in 1981 and Crown and Hunt in 1987. Again, topics for another video. But the point is that this principle, ignorance is no defense and ignorance excuses no one, has been a principle that's been applied since the 16th century. Then, of course, we have the Interpretation Act of 1978, providing general rules for interpreting Acts of Parliament. Also states that any reference to an Act of Parliament or any amendment or extensions emphasises that citizens are bound by the most current version of said law. In other words, even if there's a long-standing history of different decisions made by courts, which collectively the common law, any of those are overridden by a new piece of legislation, an Act of Parliament, a statute, these will override all previous acts and decisions of courts, and again applied with the same principle that ignorance of said laws is no excuse. Coming back now then to the principle of council tax and why there is an obligation to pay council tax, whether you agree with it, whether you have awareness of it or not. This is in a modern day Act of Parliament, remembering that this is going to be applied nationwide, whether you like it or not, whether you know about it or not, and whether you agree with it or not. The obligation is created in the Local Government Finance Act 1992. Now, I know that a lot of people believe that this doesn't create an obligation, but as I say, it does create an obligation because under Section 6, it sets out the persons liable to pay council tax. And it very simply sets out that a person is liable to pay council tax in respect of any chargeable dwelling, and a person falls within this section if on that day. And then there is a set of examples of situations from A to F, being whether they are a resident of the dwelling and have a freehold interest in any part of it or the whole of it, or B, they are such a resident but have a leasehold interest, which is different, again, subject for another video. C, both a resident and a statutory or introductory tenant of the whole or any part of the dwelling, and so on. So whichever of those you fit into, you will have a liability for the council tax. And the principal reason for having a list of different requirements there is because if you look down to F, it's the owner of the dwelling. So the owner is ultimately the person responsible, right down to a resident or tenant or someone who has a contractual license to occupy the whole or any part of the dwelling. Very brief legal distinction between a license and a tenant is that a license is just temporary permission. A tenant, on the other hand, has a tenancy, which is either a contractual tenancy, a statutory tenancy, and so on. So, in short, we can trace Acts of Parliament right back to the very first statute, the Statute of Westminster of 1275. And once again, these legal principles that apply throughout that period right up to the current day is that your ignorance of the law is not going to excuse you from having to comply with it. Meaning you can be punished if you don't comply with it, you can be forced to comply with it, and you can have things taken away from you if you don't comply with it. These are often referred to as penal notices, which appear on the face of an order, which, for example, if you get an order that says if you do not comply with this order, your assets could be seized and you could be sent to prison. This is known as a penal notice. So if you don't comply with the law, even you didn't know about the law, you may be imprisoned and your assets may be seized. So hopefully the next time you're down the pub and you have this argument as to whether council tax is legal, lawful, and there's an obligation to pay it, you could dig out this video and show them this, or just jot one or two things down and reel those off and sound somewhat clever. So in the meantime, if you do like these very simplified, very, very oversimplified explanations of the legal history of England and Wales, the United Kingdom, and of course the Commonwealth worldwide, please do smash that like button. Make sure you subscribe because over 60% of you are not subscribed. And I get several million unique viewers every month. So why are you not subscribed? It helps me. So please do that. And I thank you for watching and I'll see you next time.
Did you know the council tax is unlawful?